London had never looked so mercilessly beautiful. The streets glittered with carriages like black pearls, the sky shone pale with indifference, and inside St. Aveline's chapel 100 candles burned for a marriage no one believed in. Lady Isabella Fairfax, 20 and proud, stood at the altar as if carved from composure itself. Her gown shimmered like frost, pure silk, delicate lace, but her heart beat with the ache of surrender. Around her, society murmured behind lace fans and jewelled lorgnettes. They whispered the same story with different inflections. The Fairfaxes are ruined. She's selling herself to save them. Poor girl, married to a statue. The statue in question, Alexander, Duke of Ashborne, stood beside her in black and silver, the embodiment of restraint. His face was a study in control, handsome, unyielding, unreadable. His gloved hand did not tremble when it took hers, nor did his voice falter when he spoke his vows. Yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker, that betrayed fatigue more than cruelty, as though he had spent too long learning how to be made of stone. Isabella's father watched from the front pew, pale with relief. He had gambled fortunes and lost, and only this marriage could untangle the family from ruin. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, the room erupted in applause that sounded more like gossip in disguise. Isabella curtsied to the congregation, chin high, dignity unbroken. Inside, her heart whispered the one vow she hadn't spoken aloud: I will never belong to a man who does not know how to feel. The carriage ride to Ashborne Hall was silent. The newlyweds sat across from one another like strangers caught in the wrong play. The rain began halfway home, thin, persistent, uninvited. Isabella turned her face to the window, watching raindrops chase one another down the glass. The city fell away behind them, replaced by the green loneliness of the countryside. "You are cold," said the Duke at last, his voice deep but flat. "I am accustomed to colder," she replied. He turned his head slightly, studying her. "You need not be defiant. This arrangement benefits us both." "An arrangement, Your Grace, is a business," she said softly. "A marriage is supposed to be a promise." His gaze flicked away. "Promises," he said, "are the currency of fools." The rest of the journey passed in silence. When they reached the hall, an architectural sermon in grey stone and iron, the servants lined up in precise formation. They bowed deeply to their new mistress. Isabella smiled at them with gentle formality. They, sensing her warmth, softened. She noticed everything: the drooping ivy by the entrance, the portraits of solemn ancestors, the absence of flowers. It was a home built for discipline, not joy. The Duchess's chambers were magnificent and lonely, a canopy bed of pale damask, gilded mirrors, and a fire that burned too carefully. A maid undressed her in silence, unpinning the veil that had become a shroud. Isabella caught her reflection in the mirror. A young woman with eyes too bright to be defeated and too tired to be hopeful. There was a knock at the adjoining door. The Duke entered, already changed into a dark robe, his expression formal. "I came to inquire whether you require anything." "Freedom," she said before she could stop herself. He hesitated. For the first time, something like a smile ghosted across his lips, sad, fleeting, almost human. "That is one luxury even I cannot grant." She lifted her chin. "Then I shall make do without it." "Good night, Duchess," he said, bowing slightly before retreating. When the door closed, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The fire crackled softly, the only witness to her solitude. She walked to the window and looked out at the rain-swept gardens below, their paths slick with moonlight. Somewhere in that vast estate was a man who had been forced, like her, into a life neither wanted, but only one of them had decided not to feel it. Morning arrived pale and uninvited. The servants addressed her as Your Grace, their voices reverent, their eyes curious. The Duke had left early for business, the butler informed her, leaving no message but instructions for her comfort. Comfort, she soon learned, meant silence. She explored the house after breakfast, her slippers echoing across marble corridors lined with portraits of grim-faced men. Every painting told the same story: power without tenderness, achievement without warmth. At the end of one hallway, she found a locked music room. The key, when she requested it, was misplaced. That afternoon, she ordered it found. When at last she entered, the dust greeted her like old grief. A grand piano stood beneath a sheet, its surface dulled by neglect. She lifted the cover and brushed her fingers over the keys. The note that rang out was cracked, but alive. She smiled for the first time since her wedding. As she played, the house seemed to breathe again. Music filled the emptiness with something softer than rebellion, but stronger than resignation. Unseen in the doorway, the Duke paused on his way to the library, the sound stopping him as if the melody had called his name. He didn't step inside. He merely stood there, listening, his eyes closing for a single stolen moment. Then quietly, he turned away before she could see him and mistake curiosity for compassion. That night, the household hummed with whispers. The Duchess plays. The Duke listened. Perhaps he remembers how. At dinner, they met again, two actors reprising their roles. The meal passed with the usual courtesies until he surprised her by asking, "Did you find the house to your liking?" "It's magnificent," she said. "But I think it misses company." He looked up from his wine. "Company?" "Laughter," she said simply. He studied her as if the concept itself were foreign. This house was not built for laughter. "Then perhaps," she said, meeting his gaze evenly, "we ought to rebuild." A pause stretched between them, thin, taut, trembling. Then, to her astonishment, his mouth curved not into a smile, but something like the shadow of one. "You are braver than you appear, Duchess." "Only when I have nothing left to lose," she replied. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Then we are well matched." For a moment, something fragile flickered between them, an understanding, a question neither dared voice. And though the candlelight wavered, for the first time since her vows, Isabella felt the faintest warmth of possibility. She would not love him, not yet, perhaps not ever. But she would teach him, as only the wounded can teach the wary, that love need not be a transaction, that even in a marriage born of necessity, the heart has a will of its own. And somewhere deep in the house, behind locked doors and old grief, the Duke of Ashborne began, against all intention, to listen. Ashborne Hall was vast enough to hold 100 secrets and still echo with silence. Its corridors seemed built not merely to contain sound, but to smother it. The air was heavy with order. Paintings hung at exact angles, clocks ticked with military discipline, and every candle burned to the same obedient height. It was a house that prided itself on perfection, and had forgotten that perfection feels nothing. Lady Isabella Hawthorne, now Duchess of Ashborne, soon learned that every servant moved through this place as if they feared to disturb the ghosts of its precision. Breakfast was served precisely at 8. Conversation was not required, nor, apparently, encouraged. The Duke sat at the far end of a table long enough to seat Parliament, reading correspondence in silence. The only words spoken between them were pleasantries, as thin as the tea. "How did you sleep, Your Grace?" he would ask, not because he cared, but because manners demanded it. Peacefully, she would reply, because truth was unnecessary. He would nod, sip his coffee, and retreat to his study, leaving her to a day structured by loneliness. Yet Isabella was not a woman designed for quiet despair. Her defiance was not loud. It was graceful, deliberate, and terribly polite. Within a week, she had learned the names of every servant in the house, from the housekeeper to the scullery maid. She began to inquire after their families, their health, their hopes, questions that startled them at first, then softened them. For years, they had served the Duke as one serves a law. Now, for the first time, they felt seen by the law's new queen. She opened the long-locked music room each morning and filled it with light and sound. She replaced the faded curtains, ordered flowers for the great hall, and began visiting the village that lay beyond the estate walls. When she learned that the parish orphanage had a leaking roof and too little bread, she sent the steward to arrange repairs at her own expense. The Duke need not be bothered, she said, smiling, though she knew that word would reach him anyway. It did. That evening, as she returned from the gardens, mud on her hem and sunlight on her face, she found him waiting in the foyer. He looked every inch the formidable aristocrat. Dark coat, perfect cravat, eyes carved from restraint. "You went to the village," he said, his tone even but edged with warning. "I did." "Unaccompanied?" "With the housekeeper," she corrected. "I thought the roof of the orphanage might be mended before the next storm." "The parish has its own arrangements," he said. "They have none," she replied. "So I made them?" Something flickered across his face. Irritation, perhaps admiration, too brief to name. "It is not your duty to manage such affairs." She met his gaze without flinching. "It is my duty to be useful, Your Grace. Surely you prefer a wife with purpose to one who spends her days rehearsing gratitude." His lips parted as if to retort, but no sound came. He was not accustomed to opposition delivered with elegance. Finally, he inclined his head. "You may do as you please, Duchess. Just be discreet about your charity. The gentry dislike being reminded of what they neglect." She smiled faintly. "As you wish." When he left, she exhaled. The exchange had cost her courage, but it had given her something she did not expect, a spark of respect in his eyes. He might not have approved, but he had listened. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythms of the house began to shift almost imperceptibly. Servants spoke in softer voices. Fires burned longer in rooms that had been cold for years. Sometimes, when she played the piano at dusk, she would sense him nearby, standing in the doorway, unseen but unmistakably there. She never turned, and he never entered, but the air between them grew heavier with something neither dared name. Then came the storm. It struck one evening while she was in the village, visiting the children she had come to adore. The wind howled across the moors, turning the lanes to rivers. By the time she attempted to return, the carriage could not pass. She insisted on walking, the driver protesting, but she was determined to reach the hall before nightfall. Rain soaked her through before she had gone half a mile, and the road disappeared beneath the flood. When at last the lights of Ashborne appeared through the downpour, she was half frozen, trembling, and too proud to ask for help. The butler's alarmed cry brought the household running. Word reached the Duke in his study within minutes. For the first time in years, he moved without calculation, down the corridor, past startled servants, into the entrance hall where she stood dripping rainwater onto marble. "Foolish woman," he muttered, striding forward. His voice shook not with anger, but with fear. "You might have been lost in that storm." "I am not lost," she said, her teeth chattering. "Merely damp." "You could have drowned," he said, grabbing her by the shoulders. His gloves were soaked instantly, but he did not release her. "What possessed you?" "Compassion," she said simply. "The children needed food, the roofs needed tar." He stared at her, stunned by the simplicity of her answer. Then, wordlessly, he swept her into his arms. She gasped, startled, but he ignored decorum and carried her up the stairs, his jaw set. Servants scattered before him like wind-blown leaves. In her chamber, he set her before the fire himself, barking orders for blankets and hot water. She tried to protest, but he silenced her with a look that carried more than anger. It carried terror. When the servants had gone, he knelt before her, his hands still trembling. "Do you not understand?" he said quietly. "That I could not bear—" He stopped himself, breath catching, the rest of the sentence locked behind pride. She looked down at him, her hair loose and glistening, her cheeks pale from cold. "Bear what, my lord?" His eyes lifted to hers, grey and raw and unguarded. "To lose another person who made this house feel alive." For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm raged outside, wind clawing at the windows, thunder shaking the walls. Between them, the fire crackled softly, the only sound brave enough to exist. At last, she reached forward and laid her hand over his. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "you should stop pretending that feeling is a crime." He looked at her as if she had spoken blasphemy and revelation in the same breath. He did not answer, not in words. He simply rose, stepped back, and bowed, a gesture that was half apology, half surrender, and left her to the warmth she had already restored to his house. That night, as Isabella drifted into sleep, she thought of the man who had knelt before her fire. A man raised to command, brought to his knees not by love yet, but by fear of it. She did not smile. She simply closed her eyes and whispered to the quiet, "He is beginning to learn." Summer came softly to Ashborne Hall, though no one dared mention it aloud. The roses in the south garden bloomed with quiet rebellion, their scent drifting through open windows, invading even the Duke's carefully ordered world. The air inside the house had changed, less hollow, more human. Servants no longer whispered when the Duchess entered, they smiled. Children in the village sent baskets of wildflowers for her piano, and she placed them in vases the colour of forgiveness. Even the Duke could feel it, the warmth that refused to ask permission. He told himself it was inconsequential, that the house would always return to silence once the novelty of kindness wore off. But the days kept proving him wrong. It began one morning at breakfast. Isabella was reading a small letter, her brow furrowed in thought. The Duke, halfway through his coffee, spoke without thinking. "Bad news?" She blinked, startled. In all their weeks together, he had never asked her anything that resembled concern. "Good news, actually," she said cautiously. "The orphanage roof is repaired. The children wrote to thank us." "To thank you," he corrected. "To thank us," she insisted, her smile gentle but firm. The words lingered in the air like sunlight through dust. Us. A word he hadn't used sincerely in years. He set his cup down and, for the first time, noticed how her hair caught the morning light like gold, fighting through grey skies. He left the table before his heart could betray him. That afternoon, Isabella found him in the library, pacing between the shelves. He looked less like a duke and more like a man trying to solve a riddle with no words. "You avoid me now," she said lightly, stepping into the room. "I avoid nothing," he said without turning. "You do. Conversation, eye contact, meals." He stopped. "You notice too much." "Someone must," she replied, approaching the window where he stood. This house has been deaf for too long." He turned to her then, and there was something unguarded in his eyes, something dangerously human. "Do you never tire of this optimism, Duchess? Of trying to thaw what was meant to stay cold?" She met his gaze calmly. "Ice can melt, but stone can learn to bear sunlight if it tries." He almost smiled. Almost. "Tell me," she said softly, "who taught you to be afraid of tenderness?" His jaw tightened. "My father taught me that love ruins men, that it breeds weakness, distraction, dependency." "And what did your mother teach you?" she asked. He hesitated. "That silence keeps you safe." "Then she was wrong," Isabella said gently. "Silence only hides the wound. It never heals it." Her words struck something in him, too deep, too uninvited. He turned away, pretending to examine the spines of his books. "You speak of things you cannot understand," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Perhaps not," she replied, "but I understand loneliness." When she left, he remained there, hand pressed against the shelf, as if the wood could steady him. He realized then how terrifying it was to be seen so completely by someone you had never invited to look. In the days that followed, they began to orbit each other more closely, drawn by gravity neither acknowledged. He would find excuses to cross her path, discussing estate matters that had not needed discussion in years, lingering by her music room as though he had forgotten why he came. She, in turn, learned the subtlety of his moods, the way his shoulders stiffened before he retreated, the quiet sigh that meant apology he would never voice. One evening, as the first fireflies danced in the garden, Isabella sat at the piano. She played softly, a melody she had written herself. The tune was gentle but restless, like wind over Ash Lake. She did not see him standing in the doorway listening. When she finished, he spoke, voice low. "You composed that?" She turned, surprised. "Yes. Do you like it?" He hesitated. "It feels like forgiveness." She smiled faintly. "Forgiveness for whom?" "For both of us, perhaps." He stepped into the room, closer than he had ever dared before. "You've changed this house." "I've merely let it breathe," she said. He looked around, the flowers, the soft light, the faint hum of peace, and then back at her. "You've changed me." The admission startled even him. It hung in the air, too intimate, too raw. Isabella's breath caught, her fingers trembling above the keys. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "it was waiting to happen." Their eyes met, and for a moment, time became a living thing, something that held its breath with them. But before either could speak again, the sound of a knock shattered the spell. A servant entered with a letter, bowing. "From London, Your Grace." The Duke took it, his face tightening. As he read, colour drained from his skin. "Bad news?" Isabella asked. He folded the letter with military precision. "A rumour," he said curtly. "Harmless, I'm sure." "What rumour?" "That you married me for wealth." She froze. "That's absurd." "Yes," he said quietly. "And yet absurdities are London's favourite meal." She drew in a steady breath. "And what will you do?" "What I always do," he said, tone icy again. "Ignore it." "Then you've learned nothing," she said softly, hurt, flickering behind her eyes. "If you let their lies stand, you make them truth." He looked at her sharply, pain flashing beneath pride. "I protect what's mine by silence." "You protect yourself," she replied, standing. "Not me." The room went still. The distance between them felt suddenly unbridgeable. At last he spoke, quiet, formal, wrong. "Perhaps you should refrain from the village visits until this passes." She stared at him. "You would have me hide?" "I would have you safe." "Then we are not the same kind of safe." she said. Without another word, she left the room, her gown brushing past him like the last note of a song unfinished. That night, he could not sleep. The house, once comfortingly still, now felt suffocating. Every echo of her footsteps haunted him. He wandered into the corridor outside her chamber and stood there for what felt like hours, watching the door that would not open. He wanted to knock, to apologize, to explain that the fear of losing her was louder than pride, but when his hand rose, he stopped. Pride, ever faithful, whispered that morning would be easier. Morning came. She was gone. Her maid said she had left for her family's cottage before dawn. A note lay on his desk, sealed with the faint scent of lavender. Do not look for me until you are ready to choose love over protection. Until then, I will not be another secret in your house. He crushed the letter in his hand. The Duke of Ashborne, who had built his life on control, felt it slip through his fingers like rain. And for the first time, the silence he loved became unbearable. The letter burned in his hand long after he'd finished reading it. The fire in the hearth had died to embers, but the words glowed hotter than flame. Until you are ready to choose love over protection. They were elegant, devastating, and correct. For all his titles, Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ashborne, had mastered everything except courage. Outside, dawn crept over the moors with indifferent beauty. Inside, the Duke sat motionless at his desk, a man unmade not by war or ruin, but by the quiet truth of a woman who had asked nothing but honesty. For 2 days, he did nothing. Pride chained him to routine. He met with his steward, signed documents, spoke to no one of consequence. He ate because survival demanded it, not because appetite dared return. The servants moved around him like ghosts who pitied their master. By the 3rd day, even the walls seemed to accuse him. Every corner of Ashbourne Hall had absorbed her presence, the faint scent of lavender, the flowers she had placed by the window, the warmth she had coaxed into the air. He found her piano room locked and could not bring himself to open it. Silence filled it again, but this time it felt like punishment. When he could bear it no longer, he left. He told no one where he was going. Only that business required his presence in the north. The coachman, wise enough not to question a man with eyes like that, drove through fog and drizzle until the landscape softened into memory. The cottage stood just beyond the village of Elmswood, a small, ivy-wrapped home with a garden too wild for elegance. Smoke curled from its chimney, defiant against the pale sky. He dismounted, his boots sinking into wet earth, and stood there longer than dignity allowed. She was in the garden, sleeves rolled, her hands covered in soil. The simplicity of her was unbearable. When she looked up and saw him, she did not start or run. She merely straightened, a calm queen in exile. "Your Grace," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I did not expect the Duke of Ashbourne to visit the countryside himself. Has society grown dull already?" He exhaled. "It has grown meaningless." Her tone stayed light. "Then we have that in common." He stepped closer, hat in hand. "You left without allowing me to make it right." "You had months to make it right," she said evenly. "I tired of waiting." He flinched, but she continued before remorse could find its footing. "I did not leave because of the gossip. I left because you believed it might be true." "That is not—" "Don't," she interrupted. "You think silence protects you, but it only betrays everyone who loves you. I wanted to stay. I wanted to believe that behind your coldness there was kindness. And then when you looked at me and said nothing while they called me false, I realized you feared the world's opinion more than my heart." He took another step, the gravel crunching under his boots. "You speak of fear as though it were a choice." "Everything is a choice," she said softly. "Even silence." The wind shifted, scattering petals across the path between them. He wanted to bridge that distance, but the truth stood taller than pride. "I was raised to protect what is mine," he said finally. "My name, my land, my legacy." "And yet you could not protect the one thing that mattered most," she replied. He met her eyes then, steady, sorrowful, alive. "I came to ask for forgiveness." "You came," she said, "because you cannot bear your own emptiness." Her words struck like mercy disguised as cruelty. She turned away, back to the garden beds where seedlings strained toward light. He followed, helpless. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Tell me how to mend what I broke." "You cannot mend it with words," she said, kneeling to the soil. "You can only live differently." He sank to one knee beside her, the weight of rain beginning to fall again. "Then let me live differently. With you." She looked up, rain sliding down her cheeks, making her eyes glisten like tempered glass. "Do you mean it because you are alone? Or because you finally understand me?" He did not hesitate. "Both," he said. "Because loneliness taught me nothing. You taught me everything." The rain thickened, blurring the edges of the garden, softening the world until it felt like forgiveness itself. She stood and faced him. "The world will not forget what it said of us," she warned. "Then let it talk," he said. "I am done letting strangers write my life." She studied him for a long moment. "You think this is enough? That a confession in the rain erases everything?" "No," he said quietly. "But it's a beginning. I have no right to ask for more." The air trembled between them, heavy with all the words they hadn't said. Finally, she took his face in her hands, gentle, firm, final. "You are a difficult man to love," she whispered. "I know," he said, voice raw. "But you are the only one who ever tried." "And I will again," she said, "when you prove that you deserve what you've been given." He nodded once, solemn as a vow. "Then I will spend my life proving it." Thunder rolled over the hills, low and distant. She stepped back, shaking her head as if dismissing the storm. "Come inside. You'll ruin that expensive contrition standing in the rain." He smiled, small, unsteady, the first real smile she'd ever seen from him. Inside, the cottage was warm, alive, smelling faintly of bread and lavender. She handed him a towel and set tea before him without ceremony. They sat across from each other, no titles, no pretense, just two people with the rain as their witness. "Do you intend to stay?" she asked finally. "If you'll have me," he said. "I'll have you," she said. "When I see the man you can be." He nodded. "Then I will build him for you." When the rain finally ceased, the world outside glowed with that pale light that follows storms, the light that forgives without forgetting. He left the cottage near midnight, his heart unrecognizable in his chest. From that night forward, the Duke of Ashborne was not seen in London for many months. He withdrew from Parliament, refused every invitation, and devoted himself to the quiet labour of becoming what she had asked him to be. He visited the village often, not to command but to help, standing beside labourers as they rebuilt roofs, delivering supplies with his own hands. And when word of his transformation reached her, Isabella only smiled faintly and said to the vicar's wife, "He's learning." By the time summer ripened again, Ashbourne had become unrecognizable. The hedges, once trimmed to military precision, now bloomed freely, the fountains murmured instead of scolded, and laughter, real, unmeasured laughter, had returned to its halls. Servants spoke of miracles, though none of them began in heaven. They began in the Duke himself. For months, Alexander Hawthorne lived as if rebuilding were a kind of prayer. He rose early to walk the grounds, not to inspect, but to listen. He dismissed the estate's overseer and took his place, learning the rhythm of labourers, the patience of gardeners, the humility of work done with his own hands. When rain fell, he did not retreat inside. He stood beneath it, unafraid to be unmade again and again. London, ever eager for redemption stories, began to whisper of the changed Duke. He smiles now, they said. He laughs with children. He speaks to villagers. He gives without being asked. But gossip had never been his god again. His faith now lay in smaller things, the scent of earth after rain, the memory of a woman's voice telling him that silence heals nothing. He had not seen Isabella since the day he left her cottage. Letters went unsent. Explanations would have been unworthy of her patience. He knew that only time and proof of his change could summon her trust again. So he built a life she might someday wish to return to. And then one morning, as summer leaned toward autumn, a letter arrived, not sealed in silk, not written by a servant, but by her own hand. You said you would build the man I believed existed. I hear he's nearly finished. I shall see him myself. He read it 3 times before the words truly entered him. That afternoon he ordered no carriage, no escort, just his horse and a road that led home to her. The cottage looked exactly as he remembered, small, alive, surrounded by the wild grace of her garden. Isabella stood among the lavender, her hands bare, her expression unreadable. She did not curtsy, nor did he bow. They simply looked at each other, the woman who had taught him to feel, and the man who had finally learned how. "You came," she said softly. "I said I would." "I thought perhaps it was another promise meant for paper," she teased gently, though her eyes shone with something dangerously close to hope. "Paper never held me accountable," he replied. "But you did." She smiled faintly. "And what brings you back, Your Grace? Redemption, guilt, or simply good manners?" "Love," he said, without hesitation. "At last, only that." She studied him, uncertain. The man before her was not the Duke who had once scorned warmth. His hair, damp with travel, fell carelessly across his brow. His fine coat bore the faint stain of soil. His hands were calloused. Yet his eyes, those same grey eyes that had once frozen her, now carried depth instead of distance. "I came to ask nothing," he continued. "No forgiveness, no return. Only the chance to thank you for teaching me what I refused to learn." "And what lesson was that?" she asked, voice barely above the hum of the bees. "That love is not weakness," he said, "that it is courage, and that a man who cannot love is not protecting himself. He is abandoning his soul." The silence that followed was heavy, holy. The wind pressed through the trees, stirring her skirts, brushing his face with her perfume. "You've changed," she said at last. "I had to," he admitted. "I built my entire life upon control, and it left me empty. You broke it, and saved me in the same act." "Do not thank me for breaking you," she murmured. "That was never my wish." "Then thank you for teaching me how to heal," he said. She looked away, blinking quickly. "You are not an easy man to forgive." "I would not respect myself if I were," he said quietly. "But I will wait if waiting earns me even a fraction of your trust again." The earnestness in his voice disarmed her. She crossed the few steps between them, studying his face as though searching for the man she had once imagined. "You used to speak of duty," she said, "of legacy, name, expectation. And now?" "Now," he said, taking her hand with a care that felt like reverence. I speak only of choice. She did not pull away. And what do you choose? You, he said, every day that you will allow it. Her breath caught, but she steadied it. And if I do not? He smiled faintly. Then I will love you quietly as one loves the sunlight, grateful for what it gives, even if it never returns. Her composure trembled then, just for an instant. You have learned to speak beautifully, my lord. I had a remarkable teacher, he said. For a long moment neither moved. Then, slowly, she lifted her free hand to his cheek, tracing the line of his jaw. You still speak too much, she whispered. He laughed, softly, brokenly, and the sound seemed to startle them both. When she kissed him, it was not the desperate kiss of lovers newly found, but the quiet one of forgiveness accepted. Rain began to fall again, light as dust, and neither of them cared. Weeks later, when they returned to Ashborne Hall together, the servants lined the entryway not out of duty, but joy. The Duchess walked beside her husband, not behind him, her arm resting lightly in his. The hall, once a monument to pride, now breathed like a living heart. They reopened the ballroom for the first time in years, not for society, but for the villagers. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, children ran barefoot across marble floors, and music filled the night like laughter rediscovered. As the evening waned, the Duke turned to her, offering his hand. "May I have this dance, Duchess?" She smiled, teasing. "You've never asked before." "Then perhaps it's time I learned how." They moved together beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by light and life. It was not a waltz for display, but for remembrance, for all the storms they had endured and the calm they had earned. "You're smiling," she said softly. "I have something to smile for," he replied. "And if London speaks again?" He met her gaze with quiet certainty. "Then let them. They can only speak. We are the ones who live." The music swelled, the candles flickered, and the hall, once so silent, sang again. When the final note faded, Isabella rested her head against his chest and whispered, "You kept your promise." He held her closer. "No," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You kept it for both of us." Outside, the garden bloomed under the moonlight, the roses heavy with rain and forgiveness, and within the golden light of Ashborne Hall, love, once forbidden, once forced, had finally become free.